There's this thing people say about podcasts, and they believe it. Podcasts are intimate because we listen to them right inside our heads, right? But guess what? They're not. They're intimate only to the degree with which we, the producers, the editors, the hosts, actually make them that way. And then, boy, can they ever be intimate.
I interviewed Ellen Burstyn in 2014, and she had written a memoir where she had written about when she was 18 years old, having an abortion that was not legal. And it was a terrible experience. And she told me during our interview, like, it doesn't go away. And I asked, did you go alone?
That's Anna Sale, host of Death, Sex, and Money. Widely called one of the best interviewers there is. Just listening to her, I want to tell her my darkest secrets, which is just like thousands of guests and millions of listeners over the last decade. Anna Sale is a master of the art of intimacy, and she has a lot to say about how she does it.
I want to make something that feels warm, and even if it's like gonna maybe make some things bubble up while you're listening, that you feel like you're accompanied.
Stick with me to learn how she asks blunt questions, how she thinks through the ethical dilemmas of asking people about stuff we don't talk about how she navigates sharing highly personal stories in an enormously public forum, and also about how, in all the noise, she continues to create and nurture an unshakable community of listeners, and how you can too. This is Sound Judgment, where we investigate just what it takes to become a beloved audio storyteller by pulling apart one episode at a time together. I'm Elaine Appleton Grant. Storytellers, did you know that Sound Judgment is also a free newsletter? Every 2 weeks, get storytelling, hosting, and journalism strategies taken straight from the on-the-ground experiences of today's best audio makers, no matter the genre. Newsletters feature examples for you to try in your studio, essays on the challenges and the rewards of this craft, and news about fellow audio creatives making the kind of work we all aspire to. Sign up free at soundjudgmentpodcast.com. Anna, it is hard to imagine that there is a listener who has not heard of you or listened to Death, Sex, and Money. But just in case, I want to start by saying that you've been hosting this show for WNYC since 2014. And it's a show about, as you say, the things we think about a lot and need to talk about more. You're known as being one of the best interviewers there is. Someone who elicits very personal stories while always preserving the dignity and worth of the person you're talking with, which is a remarkable balancing act.
Thank you. That means a lot. That's hard to do. I agree. And it's the North Star. Yeah, thank you.
There's a speakers bureau called Fresh Speakers. I love what they say about you. Anna Sale is the guest you're afraid to invite, but secretly crave at the dinner table. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think so. Like, yes, I think I do add a little, grist to dinner party conversation, but I hope in a way that makes people feel, like it was a pop-in conversation and not like things got weird.
So I have this theory that most of us really don't like to have uncomfortable conversations, but we love to listen to other people's uncomfortable conversations. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think there's like a little bit of, at Death, Sex, and Money, we talk about things that we don't often talk about in the public sphere. And maybe those are uncomfortable things. But what I've found by creating the right spirit, what feels like it ought to be uncomfortable to talk about actually feels like really deep sharing. So I don't think of Death, Sex, and Money and what we do as necessarily kind of having that provocative conversation that, people want to listen in on. It's more just like that. I want that feeling of exhale of like, Oh, yeah, it's not that hard to talk. We can admit that life takes money and figuring out how to deal with money is hard and people have different amounts of money. We don't have to pretend that we're all at the same level, which is what we pretend most of our lives most of the time. So things like that. So I feel certainly people like to listen in on uncomfortable conversations. And also, I think they want to have conversations around things that make them uncomfortable. And what I hope the show is a part of doing is giving all of us a little bit more permission to try.
I like that word permission. And, I know that part of the show is sort of creating safety, right? For everybody probably involved in the show, your guests, your team, your listeners.
Yeah. And I think safety, I don't call the show a quote unquote safe space. I think what you said, dignity, is really at the heart of it. It's not like I'm not going to sort of have curiosity or make you say more if there's something that I'm not quite getting. I'm going to poke, but I'm going to do it with the intention of making you feel like I'm doing it out of a respectful desire to understand, even if I disagree or I imagine a listener might disagree.
Right, right. When I invite a guest on Sound Judgment, I ask them to share an episode of their show that they either loved making or found very challenging. And the episode that you gave us was released in August of this year, 2023. It's called Bells and Bills, The Price You Paid for Your Wedding. Tell me the story of how this episode came about to begin with.
I believe it was originally pitched by our producer, Zoe Azulay, and she's just, I think, kind of a student of the wedding industrial complex and is interested in, how weddings get pulled off and the very different ways families think about what's the proper way to celebrate the beginning of a marriage. And as she was thinking about what kind of stories we want from listeners, she got really interested in wanting to hear from either people who were just on the verge of having their weddings or people who had very recently had their weddings, mostly because just the cost of weddings, along with inflation, pre-COVID versus post-COVID, it's a different universe. So pulling off a $20,000 wedding, if you're inviting people and doing the things that wedding events take, flowers, caterers, et cetera, like that's really hard to do. So we wanted to catch people as they were reckoning with the real cost of things in this moment and hear about why they were making the choices they were making.
Yeah, I actually got married 2 years ago.
Oh,
yeah.
Congratulations.
Why, thank you.
Did you have sticker shock?
I did. I am embarrassed to say this, but it was still the tail end of COVID. We had it outdoors. I think there were 20 people, including the two of us. And we had to say to our out-of-state family and friends, it's still COVID. We don't dare invite you because it could shut down at any moment. And that helped with the cost. I want to play a clip from early in this episode because it surprised me, although in retrospect, I think it should not have.
Yeah, I remember when we did our potential invite list, Devin had about 150 people.
So how many guests did you have for your wedding?
I think 17.
Well, I think it was 17, including us, babe.
Devin and Sierra are both in their late 20s, and those aren't their real names. Because we talked about money, family relationships, and in-laws, many people asked to shield their identities for this episode.
So that was the part that actually surprised me, was the anonymity, because when I went into it, I was like, oh, it's a story about weddings and, the cost of weddings. I didn't realize that it would be this, like cloak and dagger kind of thing, but then it made sense. So, on one hand, people send in voice memos saying, I want to talk about this. And then people wanted anonymity. So you run into this all the time. Talk about navigating, finding great sources, and then dealing with their worries about being public.
Yeah. The other dimension I would add to it is I think it's especially kind of strange in podcasting because we tell a lot of stories with the participation of our listeners. So people who know the show, who feel like they're part of our community, and I think who kind of bring a sensibility of like, I'm coming into the clubhouse to share what I've gone through, in the sense of like, this is like a little bit of a protected place. And at the same time, we're making a digital journalism product that goes up online on the internet with a transcript. If you use your first and last name, it will be Googleable. And so we think a lot about that and make sure our listeners are kind of thinking that through. And we are a journalistic team. So we also have to have in mind, if we're changing names and shielding people's identities, we also want to be confident that what they're telling us is not untrue. So there's all these things happening. To me, I feel quite comfortable as a journalist withholding identifying details of people that I'm interviewing from the listener for privacy reasons. I feel very comfortable if that's something a guest feels like is important to them, whether it's because sometimes they're talking about a relationship that ended badly and they might not feel safe. Sometimes they have kids and they're talking about something that involves their family and they don't want their kids necessarily to like stumble upon it. 8 years from now when they Google their mom. Sometimes it can be something like, I'm talking really openly about my money worries and how much money I have and how much debt I have, and I don't want an employer to Google my name and look that up. Or I just don't want, this is private stuff and I want to talk candidly about the emotions around it, but I don't necessarily want it to be part of my digital record online. And so I think those are all really legitimate reasons. It does mean that like, when we change names, when we change a first name, we will tell our listeners we're changing a name. We don't swap in. We don't take protecting the identity of our listeners. We don't extend that to the idea of like, maybe we could like make up something. Like we don't bring fictional elements into our journalism. But I feel quite comfortable, particularly given the nature of the kind of storytelling we do, to have conversations with our guests about what it's going to mean, about what is exposed, about what they share with us.
So there are a lot of voices in this episode. It's crowdsourced from your listeners. I want to start with Devin and Sierra. They purchased this wedding package called a micro wedding. And here they are talking about what their wedding felt like.
The intimacy was overwhelming. I mean, as a guy that doesn't cry a lot, like I don't think I could stop crying.
Oh. And about how much do you think your wedding celebration cost all in?
I think it was about $12,000 or $13,000.
That still seems like a lot for something called micro.
Right.
So that's just a great moment. And that response is funny. And it's clear that they think it's also funny. Do you have anything to say about like how you think about balancing humor with serious conversations about things?
Yeah, I think that I like that about the way that our interviews go. I don't think consciously, oh, here's a moment when I need to like turn the camera back on me and make a joke. I think for me, it's much more sort of rhythmic and pacing. When someone's talking, if they're telling a long story, something I do a lot is like repeat back a word, do a callback from something they've said before. And I feel like what it does for the listener and for the guest is it's like, did you get that? Like, here's the through line. And also to the listener, I'm saying, I heard you and was listening to what you were saying. I think of it like maybe bolding the sentence or underlining it. And I often do that with maybe with a laugh or something. I hope in a way that like is letting the listener kind of also appreciate the absurdity of some of what comes with difficult things, not in a way of like making light or just being dismissive, but like, that moment, like $12,000 or $13,000, like where you're thinking about wedding budgets, you're like, oh, that's not an expensive wedding. And then if you think it's called a micro wedding and it still costs more than 10 grand, like that's some money, you know? Like,
a micro wedding should be a couple $1,000. I mean, micro sounds tiny, right?
Micro,
yeah,
teeny.
Yeah. And in fact, I noticed that. I was wondering in post, are you making those choices like to have some fun at the beginning so that listeners will feel like, okay, maybe we're going to talk about some serious stuff, but it's not going to be heavy right away. We're going to get a tone and point out like the laughing at the absurdity of the industry, the wedding industry?
I saw George Saunders talk about writing, and he was talking about how he talks with writing students about finding their voice. And he describes it basically as like paying attention to how you in particular use your charm. Like what happens when you are trying to sort of, you know, endear yourself or getting somebody to open up or connect with somebody. And when I hear that moment about micro, that's like me using my version of charm. It's like, that's my voice right there.
What does that phrase mean to you? It means something different to everybody, finding your voice.
To me, it's about your aesthetic sensibility, your taste. If we're extending the metaphor of like when you're creating a podcast, you're creating a clubhouse, right? And different podcasts have different numbers of doors. Some have secret codes at the front, you know, that you have to get in because they use weird acronyms and things. So you feel like you're part of an in club. Some are, you know, designed to feel very open and inviting to all. I think of my sensibility and the sensibility that I'm proud of that Death, Sex, and Money has is this kind of like, you know, it's like the doors open and there's like a porch and you feel like you can walk in, and also that you're not quite sure who's going to be sitting around in the circle inside. So it's like sensibility, it's journalistic vision, and it's also the vibe. You know, I want to make something that feels warm. And even if it's like going to maybe make some things bubble up while you're listening, that you feel like you're accompanied.
In some ways, it's easy to look back on a very successful podcast that, I mean, has been on the air for almost 10 years, which is shocking in and of itself. Congratulations.
I know, so old.
It's amazing.
Middle-aged podcast. I know.
Yeah. But in some ways, it's easy to look back and say, well, of course it has this sort of clubhouse, this community feel. But there are a lot of people starting out saying, I want to create a community. What would you say to them about the things that work and don't work?
I think the simplest thing that we have done that I feel like maybe is a step that some people skip is if you ask your listeners to do something, whether it's email you or send you a voice memo or send you story ideas, like you have to show them that you listened to what they sent you. You have to model back to the listeners, we're doing this episode about wedding and wedding costs. We're still taking your stories. Here's what Anna in Berkeley said about how she was shocked about her budget, 30-second clip, and then ask again. And it just makes it feel like, oh, I won't be the only one calling in and they're actually listening. And, oh, that story that person shared was kind of funny. I had a really different experience. Let me add that. That's not something we invented. It's something that talk radio knows quite well. If you're opening the phones don't really fill up until you take your first call. The listeners have to see you're going to actually listen to me if I take this step. And then, I'm still really interested and feel like it's a challenge to figure out how do we figure out new ways continually to make it a reciprocal relationship. What we're asking our listeners to do basically is when we put a new episode in the feed that they press play. That's the metric that gets tracked. And I don't find that to be enough, but I find the other forms of relationship to be much more difficult to measure, much more difficult to scale. But that's what's going to make a listener feel like this isn't just one of the 8 podcasts I listen to regularly. I actually feel like I have a relationship with this team who makes this thing, and I'm bought in.
Have you tried anything that didn't work?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, I don't think of these things as failures, Elaine, but
Okay.
definitely things where like people, like in maybe it was the first year of the show, everything was like fresh and, I was just like, let's see what happens. I remember I went out to Portland, Oregon to be on the show Live Wire, hosted by Luke Burbank. And I was like, I bet we have some listeners in Portland. What if we say at the top of a show, Anna's going to be on this street corner at 2 p.m. And if anybody likes to go for a jog, she's going to jog to an ice cream place. And she's going to bring sweatbands. And I did. And I will tell you, Elaine, when I was in my hotel room getting into my sneakers and collecting the sweatbands to take to that street corner, I was like, what am I doing? This is like, number one, is this like safe? Number two, like, what if no one comes? Like, why am I doing this? And I did it. And it was like actually amazing. I have glorious memories of the first listener who showed up. And like in my memory, he had like discovered the show and he did some kind of like house painting or construction work for job and was describing listening to the show while he did this work. And then somebody else showed up who was a seasonal firefighter, and somebody else showed up who was like interested in getting into audio. And we all went for like a 2-mile jog to an ice cream place and then visited. But it wasn't a huge event, right? It was high touch, but not high impact. That was the kind of freewheeling, like, let's try this thing that existed, I feel like, on our show and on, like, maybe the internet feeling kind of like more fun, enabled us to, like, say, like, let's try this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I can see how that would actually sort of go to that clubhouse mentality, even if you got 5 people jogging with you, I can see how somehow there'd be an intangible benefit to that, even if it's not something that a marketing team would say, oh, yeah, that was, that had an ROI. But I like it. I like it. Let's switch now to another guest on this episode. This is a woman you call Vanessa. Her wedding to her husband, Devin, cost so much money that she actually wouldn't tell you how much. They had 180 guests in New York City. I believe this is the woman who called you like a week before she got married. Was really fraught. So let's take a listen to that.
And when you say it got complicated, can you give me a few examples of moments where you were like, this is really hard?
Well, the guest list was definitely a struggle of who could invite how many people and family versus friends, and trying to navigate what was deemed quote unquote fair. Quickly, it would get very heated between me and my parents.
And when you say things got heated in your family, what's that look like when there's conflict?
Yelling.
Uh-huh.
And then maybe, no one's talking to each other.
Uh-huh. And who, is it all 3 of you yelling?
Mostly me and my mom yelling at each other.
And if you were going to articulate like what your mother's point of view on something like the guest list is, like how did she describe about what was important to her?
It was, we're throwing this. We, basically.
Okay.
This is just because it's your wedding, it's also like our event.
Because of the money.
Yeah. I mean, it was true.
What does that feel like to listen back to that?
Oh, I love that tape. I love that it's like a very personal, concrete story about the question of what does it mean when 2 adults are marrying and their families are invested in how, the rituals of this wedding are going to occur. And from the mother's point of view, according to Vanessa, it's like, I want to have my friends there as much as we want to have all of your college friends. And then the battles around that, specifically how they had those battles, I find also quite interesting, because families deal with conflict in lots of different ways.
Way back in 2014, Fast Company did a story about you. And the headline was "The Queen of the Awkward Pause." And there's a lot of those pauses in there where you're just going, mm-hmm, uh-huh. And then there's some silence. And then she says something else revelatory. So I had Julia Barton on the show last season. She's the executive editor at Pushkin. And she said, producers need to leave some work for the listener to do. What does that phrase mean to you?
To me, it means the first thing I thought of before I started developing Death, Sex, and Money with WNYC, I did a moth-style storytelling workshop in New York City with this great storyteller and teacher named Adam Wade. The thing that I really learned from Adam that I loved and kind of think about not just in endings of the episodes, but like in tracking and how much narration you need to give to the listener. He would be like, say like you got to the end of a story and then there were like, in the first draft you would say, and so that's when I learned that I could go on a jog with a bunch of people who listen to my podcast. He's like, don't tie up a bow. Take it off. You don't need a bow at the end. Like the listener can follow. Maybe leave with another kind of like hanging thought and then a little space and maybe music if that's the style of your show for it to like land and the listener can go, oh, yeah. I can trust the listener to make connections that we're setting up for them so they feel like they're kind of like hopping from like, stone to stone, to get across, the bog instead of being like, did you see that stone? Here's the next stone.
And you do that so well in that passage, like throughout it with the, just those little restrained, you're just listening and you're not going to help this person out by asking the next question.
Another thing that when you listen to a lot of podcasts, you learn different host styles of like, what are the odd sounds that they make to indicate to the listener and to the guest that they're listening to them in real time. So like, oh, huh. Like there's various ways you can do it. So you could like signal to the person you're interviewing, like, here's what I want you to say more of. You pick your spots for like when you say, oh, wait, tell me more about that. Or when you ask the big question that's like, I imagine that might have brought up a mix of this, and is that correct? And where you sort of present a thesis and then ask if that resonates with them. But you can't do that every time. You've got to sort of pull them out before you like say, like, here's what I'm hearing, basically.
You wrote this great Transom blog post a couple of years ago. One of the things that you said, which I loved, is you said your guest and your listeners are expecting the hard question. Don't wimp out. Tell me about a time when you knew you had a really hard question to ask and you almost did wimp out. And in the end, you asked it.
Well, it's funny because this is the part of me that I don't fully understand, but I feel grateful for because that's not been a problem for me. But I notice when it's a problem for other people. Or the other thing I notice is when it's clear that like a host or an interviewer like had an awkward moment and they, maybe had to confront somebody or a guest or a source about something and they cut out and go to tracking and then they come back to the guest or source responding. I'm like, that was a wimpy choice too. Like show us, I want to hear you doing what you're asking this guest to do, which is like find your way with words, And to me, it goes back so much to like mission and objective of being a news reporter. Like I was trained going to, press conferences at state capitals. if you came back to the newsroom and didn't have clarity on that one thing where the press release was like very vague about where this money was going to come from, and if you hadn't asked, you were going to have to figure that out. So I've always really taken that like sense of like, I am here to get this information for my listeners. I do take care to like say it's about something that's like about a very difficult traumatic event that someone knows that is a part of a memoir they wrote, but maybe they haven't talked about it out loud all that often. I think about beforehand, like, what's the question I want to ask that's not just going to sound like, will you retell that terrible story? I interviewed Ellen Burstyn in 2014, and she had written a memoir where she had written about when she was 18 years old, having an abortion that was not legal. And it was a terrible experience. And she told me during our interview, like, it doesn't go away. And I asked, did you go alone? And yes, in fact, she was all alone when she was a teenager trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. And so that told you, what else was going on that affected the trauma. Also that like she's had to figure out how to carry with her all on her own. When I ask about something really difficult, I want to either sort of like ask my guests to help me like understand a little bit more about that scene and to understand the dimensions of why something was hard. And there's ways in which sharing about difficult things can add some lightness and relief. And there's also ways, if done poorly, where you're simply making it all worse. So asking the hard question, while I think you should do it, you also need to do it with care.
Do you have any regrets?
Oh, yeah. I've been a journalist since 2005. I don't think I've always been the kind of journalist that I want to be, but I do take like repair seriously. We are working on an episode right now. There's been this wonderful guest on the show over the years named Lawrence Bartley, and he's been on the show maybe 4 or 5 times. I've sort of tracked the story of him and his family, and I first interviewed him when he was incarcerated at Sing Sing in upstate New York. And he'd been in prison since he was a teenager and was in his early 40s when we first did our interview. He's since gotten out on parole. He now is a journalist and helps the Marshall Project figure out how to package all of their great reporting about criminal justice for incarcerated audiences. And so I wanted to catch up with him. And so in this latest conversation I had with Lawrence, where we were talking about journalism and what it is to be interviewed by somebody who doesn't have intimate contact with the criminal justice system, and now what he tries to bring as someone who has had intimate contact with the criminal justice system, like what he thinks he brings to interviews that weren't present in ours. And then when we were taping, it became clear to me that the first title of our first episode was something that bothered him. In 2014, we titled Death, Sex, and Money's first episode with Lawrence, I Killed Someone, Now I Have 3 Kids. That's what Lawrence was mentioning when we were catching up in a phone call earlier this spring. And I remember I got off the phone with you and I Googled your name, and I hadn't done that. And I noticed that what comes up with your name is, your work at the Marshall Project, and then very high up is that first episode that we did together. That's an episode that I feel like is quite nuanced, but the title was not. The original title was not. And I felt this like real shame as a journalist for having not thought through, a decision that we made quickly in 2014 when we were like deciding what the episode title ought to be and to post it so it was ready to go out on the podcast feed. Like not thinking through, this is a digital media product. And it wasn't inaccurate. it also, I don't think, captured like what I think is special about that episode, which is like, this is a man who went to prison, has been arrested since he was 17, who like did fatherhood classes in prison, became a father to 2 young boys who are now teenagers. And so I talked with him about, I was like, I've decided we need to change that episode title. And now it's Becoming a Father in Prison. And we put a correction and said that we've updated the title. And I feel very comfortable with that as a journalist. The choices I made in 2014, I've changed how I think about things. I understand Google results, and I understand that there are a lot of nouns that you could use to describe people, and what you choose to lead with can have a huge effect on people's lives. Maybe regret is one of the things that I feel. I understand why 2014 Anna made the choices that we did with our production team about what to title it. And I also feel really clear that you can change things if you feel like they're creating more harm than you recognized at the time, or creating harm that you didn't recognize at the time.
It's such an interesting example in the sort of ethics of what we grapple with on a regular basis, big or small, and how these things last sometimes. You've been interviewed a lot, but of course you've interviewed thousands of times. Do you listen differently when you're being interviewed?
I don't listen differently, but I try to participate in a different way. For example, as you've been talking to me, I've had a couple of different forks in the road where I'm like, oh, I would like to understand more about getting married 2 years ago. Oh, I would like to understand more about New Hampshire Public Radio and magazine. It's where I would wrest the controls away from you to ask the follow-up question that I'm curious about. But I've chosen not to for the most part.
What makes a great guest?
I do love somebody who speaks with simple 1 or 2 syllable words, creating very clear answers. I think about the joy of what it is to interview a poet or a songwriter who speak in poems, I also, but then there can be somebody who's really scattered who is fun to talk to because they'll be like, well, I thought this, and then I thought this, and they're it's who take you on a ride. So I don't think there's one way to be a great guest, but I do love a guest who just offers a turn of phrase that transforms the way I think about something.
In your mind, what does it take to become a beloved host?
I don't know how to answer this question and not sound really presumptuous.
I'm being presumptuous for you. I take the burden.
I'd feel very satisfied that the body of work we've made at Death, Sex, and Money makes people feel invited in. It makes them feel accompanied. I think the way that I have tried to become a host that people feel some relationship with is kind of standing beside them by modeling how sometimes I'll include how something's unfolded in my life. You're not the only one who's had, hard time figuring this thing out. Rather than you can be a beloved host by being the smartest person that anybody's ever heard talk about something. I have taken the approach of we're all figuring this out. You want to come on in and join us.
At the end of every episode, I give you a few of the many takeaways from these conversations. Here are today's. 1, Anna and her team hold 2 conflicting realities in their heads all the time. The show exists to talk about the things we normally keep private, and podcasts exist online for all the world to consume and Google to find. So be clear about your show's values, practice journalistic ethics, and also the specific principles around how you want to treat your guests. Know that you will deal with these kinds of human conflicts every day. 2, how do you prep a guest? Before an interview, Anna shares how they plan to edit and use the interview. If a guest asks for anonymity, she might grant it in order to protect them. 3. Fact-checking is always important, especially these days, but if you allow anonymity, it becomes even more so. 4. Perhaps my biggest takeaway from this conversation is that Death, Sex, and Money is one big, warm place where listeners are invited in and welcomed. Anna is proud that she and her team make listeners feel accompanied wherever they take them. And 5, your guests expect hard questions. Don't wimp out. That's all for today. It's one thing as a guest to share private stories with a welcoming host like Anna Sale. But what if you have been grappling with something so personal and maybe humiliating for a long time, and then you realize, so are millions of other people? How would you make a show about that? Coming up next, we answer that question with Ronald Young Jr., the magnificent storyteller behind Wait For It.
The real question you should be asking is, what would you be ashamed? Who would you be ashamed to be seen with? Who would you be ashamed to be in love with? What would that actually even look like for you, and how would that change your behavior?
Also, if you liked my conversation with Anna, you'll love my interview with Snap Judgment's Glenn Washington. The link's in our show notes. You'll also find a link to Death, Sex, and Money there, along with ways to follow Anna Sale. If you love Sound Judgment, help us grow our show. Visit soundjudgmentpodcast.com and click on reviews. You can give us a 5-star rating that'll go straight to Apple or Spotify in a heartbeat. And leave us a review on Apple. Answer this question. What's one thing you'll use in your own practice from this interview with Anna Sale? And thanks. Sound Judgment is produced by me, Elaine Appleton Grant. Audrey Nelson is our production assistant. Sound design and editing by Kevin Kline. Podcast management by Tina Bassir. See you next time, storytellers.